May 24th, 2026, the coastal city of Cotonou, Benin. The grand wooden doors of the Palais des Congrès swung wide open, and in a matter of seconds, the geopolitical architecture of West Africa began to fracture in real time. Why would a sovereign coastal nation, one that had been heavily pressured by the corridors of power in Washington and Paris to isolate and suffocate its northern neighbors, suddenly roll out the red carpet for the very men the West had desperately tried to destroy? When the delegations from Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso confidently walked into that inauguration hall, they did not just bring diplomatic greetings, they brought the undeniable gravitational pull of the Alliance of Sahel States. This was not a standard political ceremony. This was the exact moment that artificial borders, drawn over a century ago by colonizers in Berlin, began to dissolve under the sheer weight of African survival, sovereign discipline, and the unbreakable bond of Black dignity. This is a story of resistance. It is the story of how weaponized trade and economic warfare failed to break the spirit of a united people. Wherever you are watching from in the diaspora today, whether you are tuning in from the historic avenues of Atlanta, the resilient neighborhoods of Chicago, or anywhere across the globe, the soul of the continent is speaking, and it is demanding to be heard. The tide of history is turning. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave your thoughts in the comments below, because we are documenting the true liberation of our people. To truly understand the magnitude of what just shifted in Cotonou, we must first turn our eyes away from the grand inauguration halls and look at the red, dusty roads of Malanville. Malanville is a bustling border town, the vital beating artery connecting northern Benin to the Republic of Niger. Here, the true cost of global manipulation is not written in policy briefs. It is etched into the faces of the people. Meet Umaru. He is a 55-year-old long-haul truck driver, a man whose strong, calloused hands have spent 3 decades gripping the steering wheel of a massive 18-wheeler, navigating the essential trade routes of West Africa. But today, Umaru sits in the suffocating heat, staring blankly through a cracked windshield at a highway that is completely empty. His truck, once a roaring engine of commerce and family survival, sits grounded. Its tires are slowly deflating in the dirt. The iron chassis is beginning to rust. In the heavy cargo containers behind him, tons of vital agricultural produce, onions, yams, and grain meant to feed communities across the border have been left to rot under the unforgiving Sahelian sun. Umaru is not a politician. He does not hold a seat in the air-conditioned, marble-floored chambers of the ECOWAS headquarters in Abuja. He has never been invited to the diplomatic enclaves of Paris or Washington. He is simply a father of 5 children, a hard-working man whose fundamental right to provide for his family was abruptly severed, sacrificed on the altar of Western geopolitical strategy. When the foreign directives came down, when the orders were given to lock down the borders, to sanction Niger, to isolate Mali, and to break the spirit of Burkina Faso, the international community masked their cruelty in the language of democracy. They called it a necessary intervention. They called it restoring order. But let us be absolutely clear about what this really was. This was weaponized economics. This was a calculated, deliberate geopolitical siege meant to starve sovereign nations into submission. The tragic irony, the deep and painful wound of this strategy is that the Western sanctions did not weaken the resolve of leaders like Ibrahim Traoré. They did not break the military governments of the AES. Instead, this economic warfare struck directly at the stomachs of the working class. It was designed to choke the life out of border economies. It took the food out of the mouths of Umaru's children. It forced proud mothers in the local markets of Malinville to pack up their empty stalls, go home in the agonizing heat, and look their hungry children in the eye, unable to explain why an invisible border, a line drawn by dead European empires, had suddenly been weaponized to destroy their lives. When you force a brother to starve his own brother just to appease a foreign master, you are not creating peace. You are manufacturing a humanitarian tragedy. You are planting the seeds of absolute despair. For months, Umaru and thousands of drivers like him slept under their trucks, guarding rotting cargo, waiting for a political miracle, praying that the leaders of their coastal nation would finally wake up to the realization that they were bleeding their own people dry for a Western agenda. The invisible hand of economic warfare was suffocating the region, and the working people of Benin were paying the ultimate price for a war they never asked for. To comprehend the true scale of the geopolitical siege that paralyzed Umaru's livelihood, we must pull our gaze away from the dusty borderlands of Malinville and look hundreds of miles south to the sprawling coastline of the Atlantic Ocean. There lies the port of Cotonou. Historically, this deep water port has served as the undisputed economic jugular of West Africa. It is a massive, metallic labyrinth of towering cranes, vast container yards, and unending logistical corridors. In times of stability, the port of Cotonou is the vital gateway for the landlocked nations of the Sahel. It is the entry point for agricultural machinery heading to Burkina Faso, the transit hub for pharmaceutical supplies destined for Mali, and the primary fuel artery pumping life into the industries of Niger. Under natural circumstances, the economies of the coast and the Sahel operate in a perfect symbiotic rhythm. But when the political winds shifted in Niamey, Bamako, and Ouagadougou, when the Alliance of Sahel States declared an end to foreign military occupation and asserted their sovereign discipline, the global power brokers panicked. The directives that flowed out of Paris and Washington, funneled through the regional bloc of ECOWAS, were brutally precise. The port of Cotonou was to be shut down for Sahelian transit. The border was to be sealed. This was not a military invasion. It was an exercise in weaponized economics. By shutting down the port and the border, the architects of this policy intended to turn Benin's sovereign infrastructure into a geopolitical guillotine. They calculated that if they could choke off the supply of food, medicine, and industrial components, the resulting economic agony would force the people of the Sahel to turn against leaders like Captain Ibrahim Traoré and General Abdourahmane Chiani. This is where the cold, calculating logic of Western foreign policy violently collides with the sacred dignity of the African working class. The men in tailored suits sitting in European capitals do not see the faces of the people they are starving. They look at spreadsheets and see a dip in transit volumes. They do not see Umaru weeping in the sweltering heat as his cargo of onions and yams turns to black rot on the asphalt. They do not hear the quiet, devastating apologies of mothers in Niamey who can no longer find affordable cooking oil to feed their children because a cargo ship was turned away at the coast. The economic siege was designed to look clean on paper, but on the ground, it was a ruthless, invisible hand choking the most vulnerable. The strategy of the blockade relied on a fundamental miscalculation of African resilience. The regional enforcers believed that the coastal states could effortlessly absorb the shock of severing ties with their northern brothers. They ordered the deployment of armed customs agents, the construction of concrete barricades across international highways, and the freezing of cross-border financial transactions. The Central Bank of West African states was utilized as a financial weapon, restricting access to sovereign funds. This was a synchronized, multi-layered campaign of psychological and economic warfare. The objective was to create a quarantine zone around the AES, painting them as rogue states destined for immediate collapse without the benevolent guidance of the West. Yet, as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks bled into months, the agony intended for the Sahel began to fiercely backfire, infecting the very nation forced to wield the weapon. Walk through the sprawling transit markets of northern Benin, once vibrant hubs of cross-cultural commerce, and you will find nothing but boarded-up shops and silent streets. The farmers in Benin who relied on exporting their harvest northward were suddenly bankrupted. Umaru's grounded truck is not just a tragedy for Niger. It represents the sudden, catastrophic loss of income for the mechanics, the toll operators, and the small restaurant owners along the entire Beninese highway system. By forcing Benin to sever its ties with its neighbors, the foreign powers had essentially ordered the country to commit economic suicide. The financial ledgers inside the port of Cotonou soon reflected this devastating reality. Transit revenues plummeted by staggering margins. Warehouses that once buzzed with the frantic energy of loaders and logistics coordinators fell completely silent, gathering dust. The coastal economy was bleeding out, suffocated by the very sanctions it was pressured to enforce. The Western strategy had entirely backfired. They assumed that the threat of poverty would force the Sahelian states to beg for forgiveness. Instead, the Alliance of Sahel States accelerated their internal self-reliance, seeking alternative routes and forging new alliances. The blockade did not isolate the AES, it isolated the enforcers of the blockade. It became undeniably clear to the leadership in Cotonou that they were being used as collateral damage in a proxy war against African sovereignty. The realization set in: you cannot burn down your neighbor's house and expect your own roof to survive the flames. The pain inflicted upon men like Umaru was not serving the security or prosperity of Benin. It was serving an empire that viewed African nations as disposable chess pieces. The invisible hand of economic manipulation had pushed the region to the absolute brink, setting the stage for a desperate, necessary awakening. As the economic devastation of the coastal blockade became an undeniable reality, a deeper, far more terrifying crisis began to emerge from the shadows of this manufactured division. The leadership in Cotonou was forced to confront a brutal historical truth. Whenever African nations allow themselves to be used as proxy battlegrounds for Western geopolitical ambitions, the ultimate result is always national suicide. To understand the gravity of the cliff Benin was standing on, one only had to look at the tragic blood-soaked recent history of their northern neighbors under foreign military occupation. For nearly a decade, Mali and Burkina Faso had been subjected to Operation Barkhane, a massive French-led military intervention supposedly designed to eradicate extremist violence. The West promised security and stability, but the reality on the ground was a devastating illusion. Instead of peace, the foreign military presence brought an explosion of instability. Millions were poured into building heavily fortified Western military bases, while surrounding African villages were left to burn. Foreign troops patrolled the sovereign soil of the Sahel with absolute impunity, yet the violence only multiplied, spreading like a virus. The architects of this intervention were never truly interested in neutralizing the threat. They were managing chaos to justify their permanent occupation and secure unchecked access to the region's vast mineral wealth. It was a classic geopolitical trap. The West created a dependency on their military hardware, ensuring host nations remained perpetually weak, divided, and reliant on Paris and Washington for their very survival. This is the profound tragedy that men like Umaru understood in their bones, even if they never read a military strategy briefing. When Umaru sat by his rusting truck in Malanville, he knew the influx of foreign security advisors in northern Benin were not signs of protection. They were omens of death. He knew that if his country became the new launching pad for Western aggression against the Alliance of Sahel States, it would not be the sons of European diplomats bleeding on the dusty borderlands. It would be his sons. It would be the young men of his village, handed foreign weapons to fight a proxy war against their own brothers, all while the foreign masters watched safely from behind concrete walls. The regional blockade had not only starved the economy, it had dangerously fractured regional security cooperation. By isolating the AES governments and cutting off vital intelligence sharing networks at the behest of foreign powers, the coastal states had blindly created a massive security vacuum. Extremist groups, thriving on the poverty engineered by the sanctions, began to push aggressively southward. The violence that consumed the Sahel was now spilling over the borders into the northern territories of the coastal nations. The weaponized trade policies of the West had backfired so spectacularly that they had effectively invited the very terror they claimed to be fighting right to Benin's doorstep. Faced with the total collapse of their northern economy and a rapidly deteriorating security environment, a sovereign awakening struck the leadership in Cotonou. They realized the fatal flaw in the Western mandate. You cannot secure your own home while actively helping to burn down your neighbor's house. To continue acting as the enforcer for a dying geopolitical empire was a suicide pact. The realization was sharp and unforgiving. No amount of Western financial aid could change the permanent reality of geography and blood. Benin and the Sahel share the same earth, the same water, and the same ancestral lineage. It was in the crucible of this agonizing reality that a profound geopolitical pivot occurred. The rhetoric of confrontation, mandated by the ECOWAS hardliners and their Western backers, was quietly abandoned. A new guiding principle emerged in Cotonou, encapsulated in a deeply powerful, almost painful admission. We are condemned to work together. This was not a statement of joyful political alliance. It was a sobering, absolute recognition of continental destiny. It was an acknowledgement that African survival depends entirely on African solidarity. The destiny of the coastal ports is inextricably linked to the prosperity of the landlocked interior. To save their nation from the abyss of a foreign-engineered collapse, Benin had to break the chains of the blockade. They had to look past the diplomatic pressure from Washington and Paris. They had to reach out into the Sahel, not as adversaries acting on behalf of an empire, but as brothers seeking mutual survival. The invisible hand of psychological warfare had pushed them to the absolute limit, but instead of breaking them, it forged a desperate, unbreakable resolve to reclaim their sovereign dignity. The counteroffensive did not come in the form of a military strike. It came through a calculated, defiant diplomatic rupture that shattered the illusion of Western control. The leadership in Cotonou made a sovereign decision to stop bleeding their own people for a foreign agenda. Behind closed doors, secure phone lines between Cotonou, Niamey, Bamako, and Ouagadougou began to hum, entirely bypassing the listening posts and the oversight of Western embassies. Official decrees were quietly drafted without the customary approval of French advisors or Washington diplomats. Formal invitations were stamped and dispatched, calling for the physical presence of the Alliance of Sahel States at the highest levels of Benin's state transition. When May 24, 2026 finally arrived, it manifested as a physical blow to the geopolitical quarantine. As the representatives from Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso strode onto the polished floors of the Palais des Congrès in Cotonou, they were not met with the cold shoulder of sanctioned adversaries. They were met with a deafening, thunderous roar from the Beninese public. Thousands of ordinary citizens erupted in sustained applause, a visceral wave of Pan-African solidarity that echoed through the concrete walls. This was a tangible rejection of the blockade. The people of Benin were not cheering for foreign policy. They were cheering for their brothers. They were cheering for the sovereign discipline championed by leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, recognizing that the AES had stood firm against the empire, and in doing so, had given the coastal states the courage to break their own invisible chains. Hundreds of miles away, in the sweltering heat of the Malinville border crossing, Umaru sat in the cab of his rusted 18-wheeler, listening to the crackling live broadcast on a battery-powered radio. When he heard that earth-shattering roar of the crowd in Cotonou, the heavy, suffocating knot of despair in his chest finally began to loosen. For the first time in nearly a year, his hand stopped trembling from the anxiety of poverty. He reached deep into his pocket, his calloused fingers wrapping tightly around the cold, metallic keys to his truck's ignition. By physically embracing the AES leadership on sovereign soil, Benin effectively dismantled the ECOWAS sanctions regime without firing a single bullet. This was a masterwork of tactical evolution. They did not formally leave the regional bloc, nor did they declare war on the West. Instead, they rendered the weaponized trade policies entirely obsolete through the simple, undeniable act of opening their doors. Orders were transmitted to the border outposts. The heavy concrete barricades that had choked the international highways were commanded to be pushed aside. The transit manifests at the port of Cotonou were reopened for Sahelian cargo. The physical infrastructure of the blockade was being systematically torn down by the very nation ordered to maintain it. This sweeping geopolitical maneuver was not just a victory on paper, it was the immediate restoration of human dignity. For Umaru, The dismantling of the barricades meant that his truck would no longer be a steel coffin for rotting vegetables. It meant the heavy diesel engine would roar back to life. The tires would grip the asphalt, and he could once again cross the border to deliver the sustenance that would feed the families the empire had ruthlessly tried to starve. The diplomatic shockwaves of this pivot hit the marble corridors of Paris and the strategic war rooms of Washington with devastating force. Emergency dossiers were slammed onto desks in the Élysée Palace, and frantic meetings were convened within the State Department. The panic was palpable, and it was entirely justified. The Western powers realized in real time that their primary mechanism for regional control, the ability to force African nations to economically cannibalize one another, had completely broken down. The invisible hand had been slapped away. If a coastal anchor like Benin, deeply embedded in the ECOWAS financial system, could successfully pivot and integrate with the AES, the entire strategy of isolating the Sahel was dead on arrival. This shift triggered a terrifying ripple effect for the architects of neocolonialism. The port of Cotonou was no longer a Western choke point. It was transitioning back into an African lifeline. As the transit routes opened, the flow of goods, fuel, and heavy machinery would begin pouring into Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, supercharging their economies and accelerating their projects of national self-reliance. The AES would no longer be under siege. They would have the logistical breathing room to pour concrete for their own dams, build their own refineries, and secure their own mineral wealth without the suffocating pressure of a coastal embargo. The men in tailored suits sitting in foreign capitals were losing their grip on the map, their carefully drawn lines of division washing away. But on the cracked, sun-baked asphalt of the border, men like Umaru were finally getting their lives back. The artificial barrier that had kept a hard-working father from feeding his children was crumbling into dust, ground down by the unstoppable momentum of a continent finally deciding to move in unison. What we are witnessing today across the expanse of West Africa is not merely a shift in trade policies or a temporary realignment of political alliances. We are watching the soul of the continent fiercely reasserting its undeniable right to exist on its own terms. For far too long, the narrative of this region has been dictated by the cold, calculating ledgers of foreign empires. Empires that believed they could indefinitely weaponize our economies, starve our communities, and force brother to turn against brother to maintain their geopolitical supremacy. But the unprecedented events that unfolded in Cotonou have shattered that colonial illusion forever. True liberation is never negotiated in the marble halls of Paris, nor is it granted by the policy architects in Washington. True liberation is forged in the fires of sovereign discipline. It is built when a nation decides that the dignity of its people is worth infinitely more than the approval of foreign masters. It is fully realized in that glorious, thundering applause of ordinary citizens, recognizing their own collective strength, refusing to be divided by artificial lines drawn over a century ago by men who viewed our ancestors and our lands as nothing more than property to be managed. Today, as the massive diesel engine of Umaru's truck finally roars back to life, as he crosses that border not as a pawn in a geopolitical siege, but as a proud, working man providing for his family, a profound message is being broadcast across the globe. From the bustling transit markets of Malinville to the historic neighborhoods of the diaspora in America, the reverberations are absolutely clear. The era of absolute Western control over African destiny is drawing to a definitive close. The Alliance of Sahel States, galvanized by the unyielding resolve of leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, has proven that when a people are united in purpose and anchored in their ancestral dignity, no economic blockade can break them. The map of the world is being redrawn, not by the pens of foreign diplomats, but by the calloused hands and the unbroken spirit of the African working class. This is not just a tactical evolution. This is a monumental continental awakening. We are no longer asking for a seat at their table. We are building our own table. The foundation has been laid, the artificial borders are dissolving, and the irreversible march toward total, unapologetic sovereignty has finally begun.